I was sitting on the bathroom floor of a hotel in Clearwater, Florida at 2 in the morning with $500,000 spent and 32 years of my life invested. I had just completed OTA, the highest level, the ultimate promise, and the silence inside me was so heavy I could barely breathe. It wasn't peace, it was a vacuum. It was the kind of silence that screams. I pressed both hands against my face and thought, if this was everything, then there is nothing. And it was in that moment, in that cold bathroom smelling of cleaning solution with a fluorescent light flickering faintly above my head, that something started to crack inside me. Not Scientology, me. The version of me that had believed with everything I had, the version of me that had sacrificed everything a person can sacrifice and called it devotion. If you're watching this right now and something in this story has already touched you, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It costs you nothing, and this testimony might reach someone who needs to hear it today. It took me years to find the courage to speak. So let's walk through this together. My name is Daniel Kessler. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in a house where the word spirituality was used often, but the word God was treated like something embarrassing. My father was an engineer, methodical, analytical, the kind of man who folded his newspaper at the same angle every morning before reading it. My mother was a literature teacher, passionate about ideas, always with a book in her hand and a question on her face. They weren't religious, but they weren't cold either. There was love in that house. There was laughter at dinner and long discussions about philosophy around a dark wooden table that smelled of wax and coffee, but there was also an absence I didn't know how to name as a child, something I looked for in my father's eyes when he read and never looked up. Something I tried to find in the stories my mother told, always about characters searching for something larger than themselves. I used to lie in bed at night as a kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old, staring at the ceiling of my room with the street light coming through the curtains in a thin orange line, and I would feel it. That sense that the world had a meaning underneath it that I was not yet equipped to see. That there was something behind the surface of things. I never had a word for it. I just knew it was there, and I knew I needed to find it. I was 12 years old when I first read about Dianetics. I found the book on a shelf at a used bookstore, with its faded orange cover and that smell of old paper that sticks to memory. I didn't buy it that day, but I didn't forget it either. There was something in the title that grabbed me in a way I can't fully explain. The idea that the human mind carried traumas that could be removed, that there was a better version of yourself waiting on the other side of a process. For a teenager who felt that something was wrong with himself without knowing what, that sounded like an enormous promise. I went back to that bookstore 3 times before I finally bought the book, and I read it over one long weekend in January with snow falling outside and a mug of hot chocolate that went cold beside me. Because I kept forgetting to drink it. I underlined sentences. I folded corners. I felt the particular excitement of someone who believes they have stumbled onto a secret that changes everything. By the time I was 18 and starting college for philosophy in Chicago, I had already read Dianetics twice and several other texts from the same tradition. I attended my first meeting on an October afternoon with the smell of autumn drifting through a half-open window, dry leaves, and that specific Chicago cold that bites at your cheeks. The place was clean, well organized, with people smiling in a way that seemed genuine. A woman named Patricia offered me tea and asked me what I was looking for in life with an attention I had rarely received from someone who had just met me. I said, "I want to understand who I am." She smiled as if I had said exactly the right thing, as if I had arrived at exactly the right place. And for a long time, it felt that way. In those early years, Scientology gave me real things. It gave me community. It gave me a language for experiences I didn't know how to describe. It gave me structure. The auditing sessions were intense. Those hours sitting in a chair with the e-meter in front of me, speaking with a trained auditor, going deep into memories I had never examined closely. There were moments when I walked out of a session feeling like something had genuinely loosened. A weight I had been carrying since childhood seemed to diminish. I attributed it to the technology, to the process. I didn't yet know that what was happening was simply the effect of being listened to with full attention, perhaps for the first time in my life. There is something powerful about being in a room with another person who is entirely focused on you, who does not check their watch, who does not change the subject, who simply receives what you say without judgment. I had been starving for that without knowing it. The auditing gave me that, and for years I confused the container with the content. I confused the experience of being heard with the experience of being healed. I moved through the levels with a dedication few around me could match. I worked for years at a job I hated just to pay for the courses. I sold my car twice. I lived in an apartment so small that my bed was 18 inches from the kitchen wall, and I could smell yesterday's food while I slept. But I didn't care. Every level completed brought a feeling of forward movement, of climbing towards something. The framed certificates on my bedroom wall were evidence of progress, proof that I was getting somewhere. I remember standing in front of those certificates one night, maybe 2 in the morning, too wired from a long session to sleep, and feeling something so close to pride that I didn't question it. I had earned this. I had worked for this. I was becoming something. At 26, I met Elena. She was also a Scientologist, already at OT through. And there was an intensity in the way she talked about the spiritual path that made me fall for her in the second conversation we ever had. She had dark eyes that caught light in a specific way. And she laughed at things that most people didn't notice were funny. And she asked questions in a way that made you feel like the answer actually mattered to her. We married 2 years later in a simple ceremony on a Saturday in May with strong sunlight and the scent of white flowers everywhere. I remember the weight of her hand in mine and thinking that this was the best possible version of my life, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Elena was intelligent, questioning by nature, but always within the bounds of Scientology. She asked questions, but questions that stayed inside the permitted lines. It was a skill I had also developed without realizing it. The art of asking questions that never got close to the real ones. The years that followed were a mixture of spiritual advancement and growing sacrifice. We had a daughter, Naomi, who was born on a November morning with the sky outside the color of lead and the first snowflakes of the year falling slowly. I was in the waiting room when the nurse came out and said it was a healthy girl, and I cried right there, standing up with that hospital smell that no one ever forgets. That little girl was the most real thing I had ever touched. More real than any spiritual level, more real than any certificate. I held her in the first hour and she wrapped her fingers around one of mine with a grip that seemed impossible for something so small. And I thought, this is what actual truth feels like. This weight, this warmth, this impossibly small hand. I filed that thought away quickly because I didn't yet know what to do with it. But life continued in Scientology's rhythm. Courses, sessions, events, donations, trips to Clearwater, meetings, reports, the constant pressure to advance, to contribute, to demonstrate that you were committed. And the money went. Not all at once. It went slowly, in the most dangerous way possible. A course here, an auditing intensive there, a donation to the city's ideal org, a trip to the Flagland base. By the time I noticed, more than $200,000 had already gone. I refinanced the house. I took out loans that took years to pay back. There were nights when I woke at 3 in the morning with my heart pounding, thinking about the numbers. But I had learned to silence that thought quickly. There was a technique for it. There was always a technique for it. The organization had a way of preemptively addressing the discomfort of financial sacrifice. You were taught to see it as an investment in your spiritual freedom. You were taught that the reactive mind was what made you hesitate. That the part of you that calculated and worried was exactly the part you were trying to overcome. So, every time the anxiety came about money, I treated the anxiety as the enemy rather than as information. I treated my own warning system as something to be audited away. I want to stop here for a second and ask you something real. Where are you watching this from right now? Tell me in the comments, your city, your country. Because I know there are people watching this from very different places, maybe in very different situations, and I want you to know that you are not alone. When I was at the bottom of everything, the loneliness was the heaviest part. The sense that no one around me could understand what it meant to have given 30 years to something and found nothing on the other side. Knowing there is someone on the other side makes a difference. Write it down below. I do read every single one. There were signs I chose not to see. When a friend named Marcus, who was at OTV, started asking questions about Ron Hubbard's history that didn't line up with what we had been taught, he was called into a meeting with senior members and came back different, quieter, with the look of someone who had decided to keep something locked inside. I asked him a week later how he was doing, and he said, "I'm fine, Daniel. Sometimes we need to correct course." I accepted that. I needed to accept it. Because accepting was easier than what the alternative would have meant. Marcus left the organization 2 years later. We cut contact, as was expected of us. Today I think about him with a specific kind of pain, the kind that comes from recognizing your own cowardice in someone else's story. There was another sign, earlier than Marcus, that I also chose to bury. I had a colleague in the organization named Thomas, a quiet man in his 40s who had been in longer than I had and who had always struck me as genuinely at peace in a way that I was still working toward. One afternoon after a course session, Thomas and I were walking out together through the parking lot, the asphalt hot under the summer sun and the air smelling of exhaust and cut grass from somewhere nearby, and he stopped walking and looked at the building we had just come out of with an expression I couldn't read. I asked him what he was thinking. He said very quietly, "Daniel, do you ever wonder if we've been looking in the wrong direction?" I didn't know what to say to that. I made a joke. He laughed, a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. 2 months later, he was gone from the organization. I never saw him again. For years, I told myself he had simply failed to commit fully, that his doubt was evidence of his limitation rather than his perception. Now I understand that Thomas was the most honest person in that parking lot that afternoon. The higher I climbed, the more the cost increased. Not just in money, in what was required of me emotionally, relationally, intellectually. At OT3, you receive what they call the secret materials. The cosmology that is kept from lower level members because, as they explain, it could be spiritually dangerous to encounter it before you are ready. I remember sitting in that room with the documents in my hands, the paper slightly cool under my fingers, the air-conditioned silence around me, reading about Xenu and the Galactic Confederation and the Thetans that were supposedly attached to our bodies from 75 million years ago. And I remember the feeling in my chest, not revelation, not the electric surge of truth I had been promised and had felt in smaller ways during earlier levels. What I felt was closer to vertigo, like the floor had shifted slightly under my feet. I sat with that feeling and did what I had been trained to do. I found a way to make it fit. I told myself that all great spiritual truths sounded strange at first, that resistance was part of the reactive mind trying to prevent my freedom. I pushed through. I always pushed through. Elena noticed something changing in me after OT3, though neither of us named it directly. There was a conversation we had one evening while Naomi was asleep. The apartment quiet except for the sound of rain against the window and the low hum of the refrigerator. Elena was sitting across from me with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and she said very carefully, "Daniel, are you okay? Not the Scientology answer, the real answer." I looked at her for a long time before I responded. "I think I'm more committed than ever," I said. She nodded slowly. She didn't look convinced. She was a wiser woman than I deserved in those years. She had a way of seeing through what I was saying to what I wasn't saying, and in that moment she saw it perfectly clearly. And she let me keep my story anyway. That is one of the things I love most about her. She has always given me the room to arrive at truth at my own pace, even when she could see where I was headed long before I could. I reached OTV at 38. The auditing at that level was designed to address what they called body thetans, spiritual entities attached to you that needed to be identified and released. The sessions were long, sometimes 4 hours without a break. I would come out of them with a headache that sat behind my eyes like a dull weight, and a feeling of emotional exhaustion that I interpreted as the necessary cost of spiritual work. I had a supervisor named Gregory who watched over my progress with a precision that felt more clinical than compassionate. He would review my session reports and say things like, "Your indicators are good, Daniel," in a tone that I now recognize as the same tone a manager uses when reviewing quarterly numbers. Everything was metric, everything was measurable, everything was progress or the obstacle to progress. There was no room for doubt that wasn't classified as a condition to be handled. No room for the kind of open-ended wondering that had drawn me to philosophy at 18. Every question had a procedure as its answer. I had walked into this looking for wisdom and found a system, and for 20 years I had confused the two. The money at that stage was catastrophic by any external standard. I had sold the house. Elena and I were renting a smaller place in a part of town I would never have chosen freely. Naomi was 11 and old enough to notice that her parents were stressed in ways they didn't discuss openly with her. I remember one Saturday morning she looked at me over a bowl of cereal and asked, "Daddy, are we poor?" I told her no, absolutely not, that we were investing in something important. She looked back down at her cereal with a kind of quiet acceptance that broke something small in me, though I sealed it over quickly. That girl deserved an honest answer. She deserved a father who could say, "We made choices that cost us more than they should have, and I am working on understanding why." Instead, she got the answer that the organization had taught me to give. She got the managed version. I have apologized to her for that later, when she was old enough for the real conversation. She forgave me with a generosity that still makes me catch my breath. By VIII, I had spent close to $450,000. The level was unique in that it required me to solo audit myself daily for years, checking in with the Flagland base periodically for verification. I lived with the e-meter in my home, sitting at my desk before breakfast every morning, going through the procedures with a discipline that was genuinely impressive and genuinely hollow at the same time. There were mornings when the early light came through the window at a low angle and hit the surface of the e-meter just right. And I would sit there in the silence before my session and feel something almost like prayer. Not prayer to anything specific, just a reaching, a longing. Something in me that was still, beneath all of it, looking for something that the process had never quite delivered. I want to be careful here not to make it sound like I felt nothing during those years. I did feel things. There were moments of genuine peace, of what felt like clarity. But I understand now that those moments were not produced by the technology. They were produced by the act of sitting still and being quiet in a world that rarely permitted stillness or quiet. Any tradition that teaches a person to sit still and breathe and examine their inner life will produce those moments. They are human moments. They are not evidence that the system producing them is true. Elena completed OT7 6 months before I did. She didn't talk much about her experience at that level, which was unusual for her. She had always been someone who processed things out loud. The silence I noticed in her after completing that level was the kind that lives inside a person rather than around them. I asked her once what she was feeling, and she said, "Grateful, Daniel, truly grateful." But her eyes didn't match the words, and I had known those eyes for 17 years. The invitation to OT8 came with a specific solemnity. You travel to the Free Winds, the Scientology ship that operates in international waters specifically for this level. It was presented to us as the pinnacle of spiritual achievement in this lifetime, the highest state attainable, the full revelation. I had spent 32 years moving toward this. I had given $500,000 in total by the time the final costs were paid. I had given friendships that ended because the people in them left the organization. I had given years of sleep. I had given the version of myself that used to ask questions without checking first whether the question was permitted. I had given my daughter her father's full presence during the years she most needed it. I had given my wife the partner she deserved and replaced him with someone devoted to a system. I had given my mother the closeness that might have existed between us in her last years. I told myself all of this was temporary, that on the other side of OT8 I would be so fully who I was meant to be, that everything I had withheld would be returned amplified. That was what I told myself on the plane to Clearwater, watching the clouds below me and feeling something I was naming as anticipation and was actually, though I did not know it yet, dread. I boarded that ship on a Thursday morning in September with the sun on the water and the smell of salt air so strong it was almost a taste. The Caribbean light was different from anything I had known in Minneapolis or Chicago. It was saturated, almost tropical in its intensity, everything sharper and brighter than it needed to be. I stood at the railing before going below and thought that this was the beginning of the last chapter of a very long journey. That whatever I was about to receive would finally explain the fullness of what I was. I was 50 years old. I had given everything I had to arrive at this moment. I will not describe the specific content of OTV8 because there are legal and ethical complexities around doing so. What I will tell you is this. I went in expecting revelation. I went in expecting the final piece that would make every sacrifice make sense, that would connect every dot. that would open something in me that had been waiting my entire life to open. And what I encountered was a continuation of the same framework I had been inside for 3 decades. More procedures, more processes, more instructions for managing spiritual states, more of the same architecture, just described with higher level language. There was no moment of transcendence. There was no undeniable encounter with something beyond myself. There was a completion ceremony with handshakes and applause and a certificate, and then there was dinner on the ship with other OT8s where we talked about how significant it all was. And beneath every word I spoke that evening, I could feel it. The thing I had not allowed myself to feel for 32 years, the thing that had been waiting under every technique and every level and every donation and every sacrifice. Emptiness. Not the kind of emptiness that feels like freedom. The kind that feels like the room after a fire. Everything gone. The structure still standing but hollow and smelling of something that used to be there and isn't anymore. I went back to my cabin that night and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling with the gentle rocking of the ship beneath me, the sound of the ocean impossibly quiet from inside. And I thought about Naomi, about the Saturday morning and the bowl of cereal and the question she had asked me. I thought about Elena's eyes that didn't match her words. I thought about Marcus, who I hadn't spoken to in 8 years. I thought about Thomas in the parking lot, the hot asphalt, and the expression on his face that I had refused to understand. I thought about my mother, who had died 4 years earlier and who I had allowed to die with distance between us because she had asked too many critical questions about the organization and I had chosen the organization. I thought about my father, who is 81 now and who I called twice a month in conversations that were polite and careful and never quite reached anything real. I thought about the 12-year-old boy with the orange-covered book, what he was actually looking for, what he had actually needed, whether anyone had ever told him the truth. And then I went to the bathroom, sat down on the floor with my back against the cold side of the tub, and I pressed my hands against my face. And I said out loud, to no one, in a voice I barely recognized, "There's nothing here. There is nothing here." I don't know how long I sat on that floor. At some point, the tears came, not dramatically, but in the slow, unstoppable way of water finding its level. I cried for Marcus. I cried for Thomas. I cried for my mother. I cried for Naomi and her cereal and her quiet acceptance. I cried for Elena and the silence inside her that I had never been brave enough to ask about, honestly. And I cried for myself, for the 12-year-old boy in the used bookstore with the orange-covered book in his hands, for the longing he had that was real and true and good, the longing to understand, to connect with something larger, and for the way I had taken that longing and handed it over to a system that used it without ever truly answering it. I flew home 4 days later. Elena picked me up at the airport and she looked at my face and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me." And in the car, in the airport parking garage with the fluorescent lights overhead and the smell of exhaust and concrete around us, I told her, "Not all of it, but enough." I said, "I don't think this is what we thought it was." She turned and looked out the windshield for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I know, Daniel. I've known for a while." We sat in that parking garage for almost an hour, talking, not Scientology talking where everything gets classified and processed and handled. Just talking. Two people who loved each other finding each other again underneath all the architecture. At one point, Eleanor reached over and took my hand and held it in both of hers, and we sat like that without speaking for several minutes, and it was the most honest moment we had shared in years, maybe in a decade. Leaving was not a single decision. It was a long series of smaller decisions, each one costing something. We stopped attending events first. Then I stopped my solo auditing. Then we stopped donating. The calls started almost immediately. From the organization, from friends inside it, from people we had known for decades. The language shifted gradually from concern to pressure to something that I can only describe as a kind of controlled threat. There was a procedure called a committee of evidence that was initiated against me when I began speaking too openly about my doubts to others inside. I won't describe it in detail, except to say that it is designed to make you feel that your standing, your reputation, everything you have built within the community is contingent on compliance. And for someone who has spent 32 years building an identity inside that community, that is not a small threat. That is existential. I remember sitting in a room with two senior members, the air conditioning too cold, a single overhead light, both of them looking at me with that specific expression that communicates, "We are giving you an opportunity to correct yourself." I looked back at them and felt something shift. Not anger, something quieter than anger and more permanent. I thought, I have been afraid of this room my entire adult life, and I am sitting in it now, and the fear is gone. And without the fear, there is nothing holding me here at all. We lost friends, not gradually, almost overnight. People who had been at our wedding, who had held Naomi as a baby, who had sat with us through losses and celebrations, simply stopped returning calls. There was a woman named Susan who had been Eleanor's closest friend for 14 years. They had navigated pregnancies together, health scares, the specific exhaustion of raising children while pursuing a demanding spiritual practice. Susan had been in our kitchen more times than I could count. She knew the sound of our house, the particular creak of the third step on the stairs, the way Eleanor laughed when something genuinely surprised her. Eleanor called her 6 times in the first month after we began the process of leaving. Susan never called back. I remember Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table one evening with her phone face down in front of her and a look on her face that I don't have adequate words for. The particular grief of losing someone who is still alive but has chosen absence. It is different from other grief. It has a specific texture. It is the grief of the door that is closed from the inside and you are standing on the outside of it. And you know the person is there and they know you are there and neither of you can move. Naomi was 16 by then and sharp enough to understand what was happening, even when we tried to protect her from the details. She came to me one Sunday afternoon while I was sitting in the backyard with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, and she sat down next to me and said, "Dad, are we going to be okay?" I looked at her. She had her mother's eyes. I said, "Yes, we're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long time, I was saying something true that I also actually believed. The encounter with Jesus Christ did not happen the way I would have scripted it. There was no dramatic moment, no vision, no voice from above. It happened in a bookstore. I had started reading voraciously in the months after leaving, trying to understand what I had been inside, trying to read critical accounts, psychological literature on high control groups, philosophical material about the nature of spiritual experience. I was in a used bookstore, which felt significant later, and a man named Robert, who was older, maybe 65, with the kind of calm in his face that doesn't come from technique, noticed the stack of books I was carrying and we began to talk. He was a pastor, not a televangelist type, not someone trying to recruit me. Just a man who had clearly known difficulty and had come through it with something intact. Something genuine that sat in the lines of his face and in the unhurried way he listened. We talked for 2 hours, standing in the aisle between the religion and psychology sections, the smell of old paper around us again, and he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "Daniel, you spent 30 years looking for a spiritual technology that would make you better. What if what you actually need isn't a technology at all, but a person?" I didn't respond to that immediately. I went home and I sat with it for weeks. But something had shifted. A door had opened the width of a single finger, and the light coming through it was different from any light I had encountered inside the system I had left. It wasn't the light of achievement. It wasn't the light at the end of a level. It was something older and quieter, and I did not yet have the word for it. Something free. I began reading the Gospels not as literature, not as historical document, not as religious propaganda, but as something I had never allowed myself to read before, as a direct account. I read them slowly, a few verses at a time, often late at night after Eleanor and Naomi were asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp on and the house quiet around me. The table was the same dark wood table from my parents' house, the one that smelled of wax and coffee, the one around which my mother and father had talked philosophy when I was a child. I had inherited it after my mother died. There was something about sitting at that table with the Gospels that I noticed, but didn't analyze yet, and I read about Jesus. Not the Jesus I thought I knew from cultural references, not the Jesus of Christmas cards and political arguments, the Jesus who was actually there, in those pages, the Jesus who looked at the woman caught in adultery and sent her accusers away one by one and said to her, "Neither do I condemn you." The Jesus who sat with the Samaritan woman at the well and told her everything she had ever done and spoke to her as a full human being when the culture of his time would have required him to look away. The Jesus who wept at the tomb of Lazarus even knowing he was about to raise him from the dead because the grief of the people he loved was real to him and mattered to him. I kept stopping. I kept putting the book down and staring at the table, because what was in those pages was so different from every spiritual system I had encountered in 30 years that I couldn't immediately account for it. Every system I had known was transactional. Progress in exchange for work. Advancement in exchange for investment. Spiritual standing in exchange for compliance. You received according to what you gave. You rose according to how much you were willing to sacrifice. And here was something that read entirely differently. Here was a figure who looked at people who had nothing to offer and gave them everything anyway, who touched lepers, people that his society had defined as untouchable, and healed them, who ate dinner with tax collectors, people his community had defined as traitors, and called one of them by name and invited himself to that man's house, who told a criminal dying on a cross next to him, a man who had done nothing, given nothing, achieved nothing, a man who had only acknowledged what was true, that this very day they would be together in paradise, not after completing a level, not after making sufficient donation, not after proving worthiness. That day, as he was, where he was, I called Robert, the pastor from the bookstore, about 3 months after our conversation. I told him I had been reading the Gospels and that I had questions, a lot of questions. He said, "Good, bring them all." We began meeting weekly at a coffee shop near his church, a small place with dark wood booths and the smell of espresso so thick you could almost eat it. I brought my questions and he answered some of them and sat with others and was honest when he didn't know. That honesty was the most disarming thing. I had spent 30 years in a system where questions were managed and authorities were always certain, where doubt was a symptom of spiritual malfunction rather than a sign of genuine inquiry. This man told me plainly that there were things he didn't fully understand yet, and it made everything he was confident about more credible, not less. We talked about the resurrection, which I found rationally difficult. We talked about prayer, which seemed to me like shouting into an empty room. We talked about the problem of suffering, which felt to me like the unanswerable question. And Robert did not deflect any of it. He sat in the difficulty of it with me, which is something I had not experienced in a spiritual conversation in decades. There was one afternoon at that coffee shop, maybe our 8th or 9th meeting, when something happened that I still find almost impossible to describe adequately. We had been talking about grace, the Christian concept that salvation is not earned but given, that it is, by its very nature, free. I had been pushing back intellectually because free didn't make sense to me. I understood systems. I understood effort and reward. I understood working towards something and receiving commensurate with what you gave. The idea that the most significant thing a person could receive, the forgiveness of everything, the relationship with the God who made the universe, could simply be given without cost to the recipient, struck me as either sentimental or suspicious. Systems do not work that way. Relationships do not work that way. Robert sat quietly for a moment and then he said, "Daniel, what if the reason you can't receive free grace is because you have spent your entire life believing that you are not worth receiving anything you didn't earn?" The coffee shop noise faded. The smell of espresso was still there, the low murmur of conversations around us, the sound of the espresso machine in the distance, and something in my chest broke open in a way I have no clinical language for. I started crying right there in the booth. Not the slow, silent tears from the bathroom floor in Clearwater. Big, ugly, 30 years compressed tears. Robert didn't try to stop them or fix them. He didn't hand me a tissue immediately or look around to see who was watching. He just sat there and let them happen. And in that letting happen, there was something I recognized from the Gospels, something I had been reading about, something that looked like what love actually does when it is not afraid. That was the beginning of my conversion, not a line I crossed once, but a direction I began walking in. I gave my life to Jesus Christ on a Sunday morning in October, standing in a small church with about 120 people, with light coming through plain windows and a worship team that wasn't polished but was entirely sincere, and the sound of voices around me singing something they clearly believed. The church smelled of old wood and candle wax and someone's coffee in a travel mug nearby. There was a child 2 rows in front of me drawing on a bulletin. There was an elderly man to my left singing with his eyes closed and his chin lifted slightly, and the expression on his face was the most uncomplicated thing I had seen in years. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to come forward and receive Jesus as Lord and Savior, I didn't move immediately. I sat with it for the length of an entire verse of the song. And then I stood up and I walked forward. And I prayed the simplest prayer I had ever prayed in my life, which was essentially, "I don't know how to do this, but I believe you are real, and I believe you are good, and I need you, and I am done trying to earn my way to something that you are apparently willing to give me for free." The feeling that followed was not what I expected. I expected, after 30 years of conditioning, to feel a dramatic shift, a clearing, the way finishing a Scientology level was supposed to feel. What I felt instead was something quieter and more durable. It was like being in a house that has been very cold for a very long time, and having someone turn the heat on. You don't feel warm immediately, but you feel the warmth beginning. You feel the possibility of warmth returning. You stop bracing against the cold and start believing that warmth is actually the nature of the room. That is the closest I can come to describing it. Elena came to faith about 4 months after I did. Her path was different from mine, more interior, more gradual, with less conversation and more reading and solitary walking and long silent prayers. She later described as feeling like learning to breathe again after years of breathing shallowly without knowing it. The Sunday she came forward at the church was one of the most moving moments of my life, and I have a life that contains some genuinely moving moments. She came forward during the same song as it happened, and I was already in my seat, and I saw her stand up, and I had to press my fist against my mouth to keep from making a sound. That woman who had looked at me in the parking garage and said, "I know, Daniel, I've known for a while." That woman who had lost her closest friend to silence and sat with the phone face down on the kitchen table. Watching her walk forward was watching someone finally say yes to the thing she had needed for the longest time. I reached over and took her hand when she came back to the pew. She squeezed mine once, hard, and then let go and sang. And I thought, we made it. Whatever we lost to get here, we made it. Naomi was more skeptical, as teenagers often are, and I was grateful for it. I didn't want her to convert out of family pressure or social expectation. I wanted her to come to it honestly or not come to it at all. She had hard questions that I answered as honestly as I could, and some I said plainly I didn't have good answers to. She appreciated the honesty more than she appreciated any answer I could have given. She started attending the church youth group mostly, she told us, out of curiosity. She told me one evening after she had been going for about 3 months, sitting across from me at that old table that smelled of wax and coffee. "Dad, they're not trying to get anything from me. It's kind of weird." I said, "I know. It took me a while to stop waiting for it too." She became a believer in her own time, in her own way, which is entirely hers to tell if she ever chooses to. The process of rebuilding a life after a high-control organization is not fast, and it is not linear. There were months of what I now understand was a form of grief, grieving the community, the identity, the decades, the money that was genuinely gone and was not coming back. So there were nights when I lay awake not with the heart-pounding anxiety of the Scientology years, but with a slower, sadder wakefulness, going over memories and asking myself when I had first known and had chosen not to know. I would trace it back further and further. Thomas in the parking lot, Marcus saying, "We need to correct course." Eleanor's eyes that didn't match her words. The 12-year-old in the bookstore who needed someone to answer honestly instead of strategically. A therapist I began seeing named Dr. Anita Ramos helped me understand that this backward tracing was a normal part of recovery from high-control group involvement, and that it didn't mean the decision had been wrong. She had worked with people from various such groups, and she had a matter-of-fact compassion that I found more helpful than any amount of dramatic emotional processing would have been. She helped me understand that I had not been a fool. I had been a person with a genuine spiritual need who had been found by a system skilled at locating people with genuine spiritual needs. The need was never the problem. The system was the problem. The church community was imperfect in the ways that all human communities are imperfect, and I was grateful for that imperfection. I had spent 30 years inside a community that presented itself as optimized, as the most ethical organization on earth, as the only source of the spiritual technology that could save civilization. Sitting in a church where the pastor occasionally stumbled over his words and the children's ministry ran out of craft supplies and two deacons disagreed openly about the parking lot. Renovation was something close to oxygen. These were people who were not pretending to have everything figured out, who gathered every week, not because they had achieved something, but because they needed something. Because they were, as someone once said to me, simply beggars telling other beggars where they found bread. I had spent 3 decades among people who did not permit themselves to be beggars. I had been one of those people. I had dressed my need in the costume of advancement and called it progress. In this church, people brought their actual need and set it down and did not apologize for it. I called my father about 6 months after my conversion. It was a Saturday morning in February, snow on the ground outside and a thin pale light coming through the kitchen window. Elena was out with Naomi. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and I dialed his number, and when he answered, I said, "Dad, I need to tell you some things." We talked for 2 hours. It was the longest real conversation we had had in perhaps 30 years. I told him about leaving Scientology. I told him about the money, which was hard to say out loud. I told him about the emptiness on that ship floor and the bookstore and Robert and the small church. I told him about Jesus, which was the hardest part, because my father was still the engineer who was embarrassed by the word God, and I did not know how he would receive it. He was quiet for a long time after that last part, and then he said, "Daniel, your mother prayed for you until the day she died." I hadn't known that. I hadn't known that my mother, who seemed embarrassed by the word God in my childhood, had in her later years found faith of her own and had prayed for her son who had given his life to something she feared was going to hurt him. Prayed with a specificity and a tenderness that I did not learn about until she was gone. I sat there at that kitchen table, at the table that had been hers, the one that smelled of wax and coffee, and I let that land in me, and I wept in a way that I hope my father could understand was not sadness. Or not only sadness. There is a specific freedom in grace that I could not have understood intellectually before I experienced it. The freedom is this: you are not working toward acceptance. You are not earning standing. You are not climbing levels toward a version of yourself that is finally worthy of love. You are loved where you are, as you are, with the full knowledge of everything you are. And the work that follows is not the cause of that love, but the response to it. It is the difference between a child doing chores to earn a parent's affection and a child doing chores because they live in a family where they are already secure. I know which one I was for 32 years. I know which one I am now. The difference is not in what you do. It is in who you believe is watching and what you believe they see. For 32 years, I believed I was being evaluated. I calibrated every action to the evaluation. I made myself smaller in the places where I might be found insufficient and performed loudly in the places where I might be found adequate. I lived in the exhausting crouch of someone who believes that full acceptance is always one more achievement away. Jesus looked at that and said, "Put it down. You were already loved before you picked any of it up. I don't have $500,000. I don't have the years. I don't have the relationships I let calcify or die in the service of a system that was never going to deliver what it promised. I carry losses that are real. Elena and I both carry them, but I carry them inside a life that is, for the first time, oriented towards something true. Yeah? Something that does not change its terms based on my compliance. Something that does not threaten to take away community if I ask the wrong question. Something that looked at me on a bathroom floor in Clearwater, Florida, at 2 in the morning, with nothing left and nothing to offer, and said, "You are still mine. You always were." That fluorescent light was still flickering when I finally stood up from that floor. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I looked like what I was, a man who had been wrong for a very long time and had just begun to find out. I didn't know yet what would come next. I didn't know about Robert or the coffee shop or the small church with the plain windows or Elena coming forward during the song. I didn't know about Naomi sitting across from me at the old table saying they're not trying to get anything from me. I didn't know about my father's voice on the phone saying your mother prayed for you until the day she died. I just knew that something had cracked open, and that whatever was coming through the crack was not from anything I had built or bought or earned or achieved. It was coming from somewhere else entirely, from somewhere that had been waiting a very long time for me to stop talking long enough to listen. 32 years, $500,000, and the thing that finally reached me was free. If this story stayed with you, I want to invite you warmly. Subscribe to this channel, because this space exists for exactly this kind of testimony, for the stories of people who went looking for something real and took the long way around before finding it. There are people watching right now who are in the middle of that long way around, and they need to know that there is a way through, that the longing they feel is not a malfunction, that the need underneath it is not a weakness. Your subscription helps these stories reach further. It helps someone sitting on a floor somewhere know they are not the last person this has ever happened to. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.